We really appreciate you joining us. This is the Bargaining for the Common Good Higher Education Finance Training Series. It's the second in the series. We did our first training a couple of weeks ago on debt and locating bonds and other debt tools that higher ed institutions use. And this is the second part of that, thinking about if you've identified a particular piece, what is the next step? What do you do with it? I'm Sarah Michaelbus, Research Director with Bargaining for the Common Good, and I'm going to pass it over to Lisa Cody and Corey Sherman to start in a second here, but just wanted to give a little bit of background on Bargaining for the Common Good in case folks haven't.
Sarah, real quick, could you record, because I can't record and I'm going to be gone, so you might want to record it.
I can't. We're automatically. Last time we did the recording, if you've seen it, we started a little late, so I made sure to automatically record. Awesome. Okay. So we are recording this, and I should have noted that. Thank you, Lisa. Other piece is Bargaining for the Common Good is a network of labor unions and community organizations across the country that are bringing folks together to think about how we can use the bargaining and organizing process to work together to fight for all of our community members and ourselves as workers and as community, and really take on particularly like big corporations and other folks that are dominating our economy and our systems and furthering the oppressions that we're all experiencing. So really encourage you to get involved in any way that you can. I'll put my contact information in the chat box in case you're interested in that. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lisa and Corey. Thank you both so much.
Hi, welcome everybody. So this is part 2, as Sarah mentioned, to our original presentation, which all of you can access if you weren't involved in the original one. But we were hoping people would go out and collect data on debt, specifically loans and or bonds that universities, whether they're private or public universities, are taking out. And this is really to look into predatory finance, looking into whether the institutions have loans or financial obligations that are basically going to cause the institution to either go bankrupt or to head into financial difficulties, and which result in layoffs for your members, or colleges maybe that you're looking into to organize. And this would be information you could use to leverage in terms of working with the university. So there's lots of applications for this information, but so this is sort of step 2 where we look into how to use this data. So you can go to the first slide, Corey. So as I stated, we had hoped, and we hope some people have gone through and sort of started to look at if there are possibly loans or bonds. And again, there will be other trainings that relate to other kinds of issues at schools, whether it's public-private partnerships or too high management, too many managers for an institution, that sort of thing. But we're just looking specifically at finance issues in these trainings. And let me minimize my screen here so I can see my whole slide. Sorry. So wait, we're already on conflicts. Can we go back up? Yeah. So you've also identified at some point, what institutions involved, whether there might be players, more than one player involved, and now we need to look at how they actually relate to the organization, what relationships there are. Okay, go ahead. So there's all sorts of issues you can look at. One would be, of course, conflicts of interest. And what do we mean by conflicts? Are there any personal or business ties between the college board members or trustees and perhaps the landlord? So you might have some universities or institutions that lease property. They might have outside relationships with the owner of that property in both public or private sector. They might have personal relationships with them. There might be other business relationships outside of the relationship of investing in the actual lease. There could be financial relationships between a trustee and the lender. We had a situation where one of the board members had hundreds of millions of dollars in loans for private use and for business use in commercial real estate between the lender and the school. And this person actually was the one who recommended that lender to the school. So this person went above and beyond to actually introduce that lender to the school. So, and whether she actually benefited from that transaction in terms of, loans at a lower rate, we have yet to find out. But that is a conflict of interest regardless. Anytime you had a board member serving concurrently on 2 colleges or 2 nonprofits that may or may not do business with each other. If they have a business relationship, they might have a lease, they might have other relationships. That is a conflict because their loyalties are divided. Just the very nature of their loyalties is divided. So anytime you have a board member whose loyalty is not first and foremost the school, then that's a conflict. You can have corporate laws that are violated. So most of these private foundations are incorporated. The whole point of being incorporated by your state, whatever state you are looking at, is to protect the members, the trustees or the board members or directors from individual liability. If they have individual liability, then the decisions they make can be held financially accountable for those. So the issues that happen with a lot of these nonprofits is there's a couple things. At a large sort of high level, if they do not behave like a corporation, if they do not have, for example, articles of incorporation, bylaws, or other documents that constitute, are sort of the way in which the organization should be run, they actually can be considered a group of individuals and not a corporation. So in other words, that's when you go after a corporation, you say you've pierced the corporate veil. In other words, they don't actually even count as a corporation because their individual members don't abide by any sort of rules of incorporation. Sort of a secondary violation would be if any of the individual board members themselves violate their fiduciary responsibilities, either through absenteeism, not attending board meetings, a certain minimum number of board meetings, failure to establish or follow the rules of incorporation, any bylaws, or any constitutive documents of the foundation. So there are a number of different violations in California that we're going to go through, and you would have sort of different corporate incorporation laws that in your state that you would have to look up, but we're going to go through those that apply to California. And obviously, you can go to the next slide, Corey. The whole point of this is to identify what sort of angles, when we were given this job by our boss, it was sort of find anything on this institution because they were going to lay off all our members. They're closing the school. They were possibly going to go bankrupt. So anything you could find. So we were looking at everything. We were looking at conflicts. We were looking at any breaches of fiduciary duties. We were looking at self-dealing. And self-dealing, by the way, is a separate category from conflicts of interest. And there's some very specific categories of individuals that are involved in self-dealing. So we started looking into all these sort of things in order to actually identify ways in which we could save the school and possibly hold the individual trustees accountable for the failure financially of the school. We actually sent a report to the AG confidentially in hopes that the AG would find that would actually go after these individual trustees to save the school. And just to be clear, all of the trainings, all of the comments, all of the sort of information in this presentation is broadly applicable to any kind of opposition research that you're doing in an organizing campaign. It doesn't have to be about higher ed. It doesn't have to be about finance. It could be about anything. So we're going to give you some very general research tools as well, and Corey will deal with that at the end of the presentation. All right, next slide. So Sarah's going to go through a really glaring, obvious gift of a conflict that she dealt with at Arizona State University. And it's not always this obvious or easy or fun, but this was a true glaring example. And so Sarah, take it away.
All right, folks. So we just wanted to give you, as Lisa was saying, sort of a gift, but an example from a campaign that we were all involved with. Well, not all of us together, but that one of us was involved with to show you kind of what we're talking about. And this didn't involve as much in-depth, like really deep research as what some of what we'll talk about today does. So it helps you understand, even if you don't have a ton of resources, this is always going to be helpful and applicable, the skills we're talking about today. So I looked at Arizona State University, which is based in Tempe, which is a suburb of Phoenix. in Arizona over a decade ago. And I was investigating the president and the leadership and different relationships and really identifying the circle of influence, as you might call it. So family members of those leaders, past university presidents, different connected nonprofits, including the University Foundation, but also others that are kind of in that circle of influence, and attempting to identify what's legally called disqualified persons. And Lisa will go into that in more detail in a second, but just wanted to flag that here. So I did an analysis of the University Foundation, the ASU Foundation, as well as related nonprofits. The IRS Form 990, for those that are familiar with it, the foundations and other nonprofits have to file that every year, and looked over time, including a change in presidents, and found some very interesting things looking at the top paid employees. You can go to the next slide. Awesome. So this is a page out of a report that I wrote on the foundation. And related to what we're talking about today, one of the things that showed up, and you can see in the turquoise box, Sybil Francis is Dr. Michael Crow's wife. He's still the president there, and she was one of the top 5 paid employees at Arizona State University. So that in of itself sort of draws up some questions. But then also found that she, at the same time, was listed as a top paid employee at a related nonprofit called the Center for the Future of Arizona, run by a former president of Arizona State University named Laddie Core, also paid a 6-figure salary. So we published this report, and this information in particular was covered. It was covered in multiple higher ed publications, including the Chronicle for Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed, and a couple of others, as well as in the statewide published newspaper in the front of the metro region. And we got a couple of folks in the local news to cover it on television on the news as well, which is pretty rare for this kind of research and reports and things like that. And we didn't stop there. We'll talk a little bit later about different ways to share information. I'll share a little more detail about how to use this type of thing. But it definitely had a lot of impact in our campaign and work we were doing to help support workers that were organizing in construction locally. All right, I'll pass it back over to Lisa.
Great. Let me turn my, okay. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. So there's a number of ways in which you can breach your fiduciary duty. And this is true for California, and it's probably similar in a lot of states, but this is corporate California law. So there's 3 duties. There's the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. So the duty of care is sort of a very sort of baseline. Anyone who's a normal sort of prudent person in the same position, would they make that sort of decision with a general level of knowledge? In other words, if I'm someone who wants to buy a home and I'm walking into a bank and I know, for example, that I don't have a steady job, that I don't have enough for a down payment, that I probably can't make my payments each month, I wouldn't enter into a bank loan, into a mortgage, knowing that, and certainly a bank shouldn't allow me to, because it doesn't make sense. It's an estimation of sort of an obvious, I don't have the resources to do that. So a director or a trustee who enters into a transaction, for example, they don't even have to be a financial expert, but any level sort of prudent person would say, maybe this isn't a great transaction. So if you enter into that as a director or trustee, you violated a duty of care by basically not sort of assuming a basic level of sound financial judgment. Your duty of loyalty is more about more related to sort of conflicts. In other words, that you don't necessarily have the private foundation or university's interest in inherently as your number 1 priority. So you might be a member of another nonprofit at the same time that's dealing with the nonprofit of interest, the school, and your loyalty is divided between those. You're breaching your duty of loyalty if the organizations are interacting in some way and you're voting on those issues and your loyalties are divided. And even if you're not voting, I'd still say you may be breaching your duty of loyalty. But anyway, you can there's obviously judgment lines here. But then there's the duty of obedience, which is you have to abide by the rules. You have to abide by your mission statement. You have to abide by the policies, the rules sent by the corporation, the bylaws, and any state and federal laws which you are required to adhere to. So any of these sort of breaches creates problems for a nonprofit and would actually allow you to, like an AG, to go and investigate, at least in the state of California. So we found breaches in all of these categories when we did an investigation of one of our schools, basically by different members. Some of them breached all of these at the same time, and some of them breached only one or two, but there were a number of trustees that breached all of these. Next. Okay, self-dealing is a very specific sort of transaction under California law. And so it's basically, in a general sense, it's a contract, an agreement, or an action that affects the assets of the public benefit, like your school, but that the person is a party to in some way and will benefit in some sort of material way. Under federal law, self-dealing is a lot more sort of more narrowly defined or more strictly defined. But in general, self-dealing is where you're going to have an individual that is benefiting, that's related to both your public benefit corporation and some sort of private entity, and they're benefiting in some way, in a very general sense. Go ahead, next slide. And I'll explain why. Okay, so I'll explain why self-dealing is a problem and just, you can stay here, but self-dealing is a problem because for a nonprofit like a 501(c), if you have self-dealing going on with what's called a disqualified person under federal law, the person may have to pay what's called excise, an excise tax on any money that they've actually sort of derived some benefit from. And it can be substantial. It can be 200% of what they've actually, 10% of the amount involved for the initial, and then for any additional tax, it can be a 200% of the amount involved that they've benefited. So there's reasons why this is a problem. There's also a problem related to excess benefit transactions for a nonprofit in general. If someone benefited from a business holding or some kind of that disqualified person, that actually ends up having to be paid back to the foundation. So there's steep financial consequences in the IRS tax code for self-dealing transactions. And self-dealing is when your foundation has an interaction with a disqualified person, and that disqualified person gains some financial benefit. So the disqualified people are many, many different kinds of people. And this is fairly complicated. I won't go into detail on all of these. But basically, I'll tell you right now, from looking into this more clearly, this is a really, really, really good way to nail people. Because a substantial contributor is anyone that gives more than $5,000 in any year as a donation or bequeaths that money. And if that $5,000 is more than 2% of the amount donated to the organization at any time. So let's say they donate in February and no donations have come in. Well, that immediately becomes a substantial contributor because they've donated more than $5,000, and it represents all of the money that's been donated. And it doesn't even matter if by the end of the year, $100,000 is donated and the $5,000 is no longer 2%. It's when they donate and how much it is a percentage. And they stay a substantial contributor and a disqualified person for 10 years, basically, until they haven't donated any more money for 10 years. So this can really, really, this person remains disqualified, or the entity remains disqualified for a very long period of time. So it's very, very interesting and something that you should definitely look into in your organizations. Most of our trustees, for example, give, I mean, they're already qualified as a manager of the foundation, but a lot of organizations give $5,000, $10,000 each year. Those are going to become disqualified organizations depending on when they donate. So a foundation manager, of course, is anyone like a board trustee member, a treasurer, anybody that's defined in the bylaws of the organization, or anyone that rules the organization on a day-to-day basis in an administrative function. Those are obvious sort of groups. The owner, or 20% more, so 20% owners, that's what this is, owner of more than 20%, are organizations that So anybody that's a substantial contributor, so in other words, an organization can give $5,000 and be a substantial, an individual can, a corporation. Anyone that owns 20% of that organization also becomes a disqualified person. So anybody that owns more than 20% of a substantial contributor, being an entity or corporation, also becomes disqualified. So it starts to get a pretty broad net people who are disqualified from gaining sort of financially with your institution. In addition, any family members, meaning a child, an adopted child, the spouse of an adopted child, any lineal descendants of anyone in sections 1 through 3, any of those family members, not sisters or siblings or brothers, but all lineal descendants, grandfathers, grandmothers, children. And then you get into the other sort of, well, I'll skip to 9 really quick. Any government officials are automatically they're automatically disqualified. It doesn't matter how much they interact or the amount, they're immediately considered disqualified. Number 8, private foundations. Any private foundation who is ruled by the same people, so a person that sits on the board and controls most of the board of your school and also controls most of the board of another nonprofit, is also, that other nonprofit is disqualified as a disqualified entity. And then the other categories, so a corporation is disqualified if a substantial contributor, a foundation manager, or a 20% owner or family member of those owns more than 35% of the total combined power of that corporation. So let's say there's a substantial contributor, that individual happens to own another company, and they own more than 35% of that company, or they control 35% more of the board, or the votes, or the profits. That's true of all these, the partnerships, the trust. Any substantial contributor, family member, 20% owner, any of them that controls more than 35% of any partnership, corporation, or trust, they all become disqualified. Okay, so you can imagine how large this net is sort of thrown. And again, this becomes an issue. Those interactions with your nonprofit all become either an excess benefit transaction or a self-dealing transaction, which has financial consequences. Go ahead. So I realize that's a bit, that you can get detail on this under IRS section 4946, but suffice to say that it becomes very broad very quickly, and you can use this very effectively against trustees that are using these schools to their own benefit. Go ahead. Next slide. Okay. So self-dealing under federal law is what I just talked about, is the acts of self-dealing between a private foundation and disqualified person. It can be all sorts of things. It can be direct, where there's some sort of lease or sale or exchange of property. These are really obvious things, like the person gets a lease through their company because of the nonprofit, or they get some kind of good or services and benefit from it. They get paid compensation or reimbursement to a disqualified person. It may not always be this obvious. There's also indirect self-dealing, which is where your nonprofit controls another entity and you derive benefits from that controlled entity. But I'll give you an example of where it gets kind of with one of our situations. We have board members who had businesses that benefited sort of indirectly from a real estate transaction that happened with the school we were in. So their businesses were boosted because of that transaction. That gets a little more complicated. We have yet to figure out whether it's truly self-dealing, but again, it can get very intricate, or it can be very obvious that they get some sort of obvious money or land or a better deal or whatever it is between your private foundation and a disqualified person. This repeats that transaction between a foundation and corporation, that just repeats the disqualified person category. So again, self-dealing, there are some exceptions under IRS rules. They're pretty narrow. I'll give you an example. So a government official, I told you, anytime they interact with a nonprofit and derive benefit, it's typically self-dealing, unless, for example, everyone benefits. Like everybody in the public gets the same benefit that they did. That wouldn't be considered an excess benefit transaction. It's sort of like when I worked in Congress for a while, like you could go to a meal as long as everyone got the same meal. as long as people weren't using silverware. And like, there's all sorts of like rules about when it's considered like a problem and not a problem. So again, there's all sorts of rules you can look at, but in general, these are the kinds of things that are going to help you gain leverage in your, either in your organizing campaign, or if you need to save a school. These are the kinds of things that we went to the AG with, hoping that we could hold our board members financially accountable. They're all very wealthy on our board. Oftentimes they are. They all have sophisticated real estate deals in their own dealings. And the hope is that you can actually, in our case, save the school and hold the members, their personal income, accountable to save the university that we're involved with. All right. And so self-dealing transactions can be approved. It's disappointing to hear that. I told you there's some exceptions under IRS rules, but there actually are quite a few exceptions under state law. If, for example, the director, if that's the disqualified person or the person that's involved, if they don't benefit tremendously or unduly, then it could be approved. If the corporation receives a benefit from it and the benefit is sort of equal to what they would have in another deal, the director can't be directly involved. They can't vote on it. The board has to be aware of the conflict. There are all sorts of circumstances that allow a self-dealing transaction to be approved, but these things have to be done before the transaction occurs. The board member or the trustee has to basically recuse themselves from the process. They have to be honest and upfront about it. Typically, they have to contact the AG in communication and relate that they're going to do this, that they're having a self-dealing transaction, that they have a conflict of interest, and that it may result in a self-dealing transaction. So there are exceptions. Again, so before you go, jumping off to your legal advisor about this, it's always good to look into whether, for example, in the board notes, the person recused themselves from the vote, whether they wrote to the AG and said, we have this self-dealing transaction, we'd like it approved. All those things would basically exempt you from going after that individual member, because it's an allowed exemption. All right, next slide. All right, so I'm done with my section. Now Corey's going to go through and sort of help you identify how to find all this information and what are sort of the best resources to find it. And this is really, really useful information, not just for the research we're talking about, but for all opposition research.
Thanks, Lisa. So yeah, as Lisa said, this portion of the training will be how you can find the information that relates to fiduciary breaches or conflicts of interest, or self-dealing, but also how you can really build profiles internally for the people who make the decisions, for the power players at the universities that you represent. The first place we start is with public record search. Public record searches. We use LexisNexis, which is a very useful database. This enables you to identify members of the board and their corporate affiliations. So the companies they have worked for, the companies they have owned. This also enables you to identify property they own. It helps you identify mortgages they've taken or liens that have been placed on them. And that's important because it'll start to help you identify if there are any links between the corporations, the individuals on the board, and the financial institutions lending to the university. So you may find out that board member X, who does a lot of real estate deals, receives tons of financing from the same bank that extended a loan to the university. You can also determine if board members' families have connections to the financial institutions lending to the university. Sometimes people will register LLCs in their family members' names. So they are kind of shielded from the transaction. All of this can be found through LexisNexis public record searches. And I would say also an added benefit of Lexis is that there's a media search, and this media search accesses a lot of industry and business journals that wouldn't be available through a Google search. And if they would be behind a paywall. So if you're trying to find reports on a board member's corporate actions and sort of building your profile on this board member, you'll find that there are some journals and publications on Lexis that'll have snippets on the sort of inside baseball of whatever industry they're working in. But Google is really your friend in this regard. After you've identified a board member and their corporate affiliation, you should go to Google and conduct searches, both of the board member and their corporate affiliations together and separately, and try to go through about 15 to 20 pages and see what you find. That's kind of a good rule of thumb. If the person or their business has a very large profile, you may need to go 40 or 50 pages deep, but you can find a lot of information on people in 15 to 20 pages. And I tend to do both a web search and also a news search on Google, 15, 20 pages each. You also want to look at folks' LinkedIn pages. You may find that a board member, a corporate affiliation you identified on LexisNexis does not appear on their LinkedIn page. So the question is, why are they not listing it on their LinkedIn page? This is just, again, to help you build a profile on what your board member does or doesn't do. You also want to find their Facebook profiles, see what they're posting. You may identify connections they have in this world through their friends on Facebook or on Twitter and on Instagram. And there are really a few goals wrapped up into this search. You want to be able to create a profile of the board member that shows that they have business acumen, that they are in fact a wildly successful person, which is why they're on the board in the first place. If you can show that someone is successful in their personal and professional life, but they're making bad deals at the university on whose board they sit, that will enable you to make a claim of duty of care breach. And if you find connections between the corporation and university affiliated entities or other nonprofits, you can make a duty of loyalty claim. You know, if you see that they have deep ties to the bank that lent to the university, or if they have ties to another nonprofit, this is the information that it will enable you to make that claim. But just generally, you know, if you're doing a power mapping exercise on your campaign, these types of searches will help you build a profile of the decision makers at the school or nonprofit or corporation that you're organizing at. This is a more targeted way of doing searches on Google. It's called site searches. And what you do is you type into the Google search bar site : and then you could put in a web extension here. So in this instance, I put .gov, and then you search the person's name or their corporate affiliation. And what that will do is show you everywhere on a .gov website that the board member's name comes up or the board member's corporation comes up. You can do the same thing for .org, and you could do the same thing for whatever municipality or state you're working in, whatever web extension they use. You search site : web extension, and then the name. And this is, again, to help you build the profile of the board member by identifying their connection to public and nonprofit entities. But you don't just, it's not just .gov or .org. You can do any web extension or any website. So you can do site : and then search your university's web address and put their name in. Sometimes universities will store internal files somewhere on their website, and they don't necessarily realize that they are available through Google site searches. And you can sort of find a whole trove of internal documents that you would otherwise request in an RFI. Sometimes you can really just access that through searching by doing a site search of the university's website and the person's name or corporation. So yeah, it's about building the profile, but it's also about being able to show if they have any other loyalties besides their loyalty to the university on whose board they sit. One website that you're going to want to specifically target when you're doing opposition research into the board, or if you suspect that there's corporate malfeasance, is an SEC.gov site search. That's the Securities and Exchange Commission. And by searching that, you'll find out where in any corporation's SEC filings this board member or the company that they owned or worked for appears in those filings. So if the board member you're researching served on the board of a publicly traded corporation, they will come up in the SEC filings for that publicly traded corporation. And if they sit on a publicly traded corporate board, usually the SEC filings, the document that you'd find mostly is called 10K. There's short biographies about these board members. So maybe you haven't identified everything about them through your Google searches, through your Lexis searches. If they served on a publicly traded board, there will be bios of them in the SEC filings that corporation files. And you can also, by searching the corporate affiliation that the board member has in the SEC site search, you'll find out whether this corporation, if it's a small corporation or a medium-sized corporation, whether that's been purchased by a publicly traded corporation. So on one case that Lisa and I worked on, there was a board member who had a audio equipment company. So when I searched for that by using an SEC.gov site search, I found that the audio company was bought by a media conglomerate and then later sold by a media conglomerate. And what that enables you to do is kind of get an estimate about, how much money this individual might have. If their corporation was bought and sold for $50 million twice, and the school you're researching or you're organizing at is having trouble raising money, that begs the question, well, why isn't this person contributing to the financial health of the school? And lastly, doing the SEC site search, it again helps you determine instances of self-dealing. If there's a corporation that the board member is affiliated with that's doing work with the university, you may be able to identify that using the SEC site search. I strongly encourage you to play around with SEC site searches. And in addition, you wanna search other government websites to find whether there's any noteworthy or adverse reporting on the board member or their affiliated corporation by a government agency. And with these websites, you want to search internally on the search bars that each website has, but those are often not complete. So you can search all of these websites like you do the SEC site search. You can search these different websites. You want to try to identify who your board members are giving political donations to, finding out if the union that you work for, that you are a member of, that you organize with, has any connections to these politicians, and find out if the board members have similar connections. Or on the other hand, if they're donating to politicians whose interests, whose political agenda does not serve the interests of the institution. This is all information that you want to be able to have at your disposal. If you search for the company that the board member owns or worked for in OSHA, you can find if there are any safety violations or labor disputes. If you search in the DOJ or in the state attorney general sites, you can identify if there's any pending litigation or any pending legal complaints against them. And specifically for our folks here who work in the public sector, the system of award management and federal procurement data system, this is the publicly available search system for government contracts. So you may want to find out if your board member in whatever state you're working in is receiving large government contracts. That may not be a conflict of interest. It may not be a breach of fiduciary responsibilities, but it's important data to know just sort of where your board member sits in the nexus of government power in your state and in the country. And you could also do the same thing in the Department of Commerce searches. And then there are specific financial regulatory agencies that you should search your board member or the corporation. And this is to determine if the board member or corporation has been cited as a bad actor in finance specifically. And those websites, as you see there, are FINRA, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, NFA Futures, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And then the other two databases that you want to search that you won't often find your board members in these databases, but if you do, that would be a red flag. And again, you want to search the board member and their corporation. And these are two investigative journalist databases used often by investigative journalists. One is by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It's the Offshore Leaks database. So this is the consortium that published the Panama Papers. They have other leaks that you can search. And then this ALIF, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, this has corporate and government leaks databases. So, you know, if your board member showed up in the Podesta leaks, or if your board member shows up in, you know, leaks from one board member I was researching, their companies, I identified their companies in a search where they were known to be purchasing hacking software. So these are kind of like red flag databases. Don't expect to find too much here, but if you do find something there, it's a red flag.
So Sarah, take it away.
So, you know, folks can put questions in the chat box if they have any. If not, totally fine, or we can also wait till the end. But we wanted to talk a little bit about, now that you've heard from both Lisa and Corey about how to collect the information, what kind of information we're looking for, what can you do with this information, how is it powerful, right? Strategic research, oftentimes we go out, we get things, and the first thing we want to highlight is from the beginning, you want to really be thinking about your goals and what you're trying to accomplish. But after you've collected that information, how can you use it? So Lisa's going to talk in some more detail about the potential legal actions that you can take. Going to court is always an interesting process. It can take a really long time to get results. So we also wanted to highlight and help folks think through what does strategic campaigning approaches look like. A lot of times when we're doing this work, we think about sharing things with the public or media. And I want to encourage folks to think a little bit more deeply about what that looks like. So what do we mean? Key audiences that you can share this type of information with. The first questions you want to be asking yourself is, who's going to care about this information? And who are the folks that the people that you're targeting will care about their opinions, right? Those two questions are the most important ones, right? And where the overlap is between those. You also want to think about how you're going to communicate with these folks. Media is not the only way to do that, right? You can also do that directly. You can visit them, you can mail them. How is it? Are there gatherings and places that they're at that you might be able to share this information in various forms? And then who are the groups of folks? So getting more specific, right? Even with when you're trying to get media attention, are there industry publications? Are there local media and other folks that you might be able to get attention of rather than focusing on national media or even regional, right? Are there public officials at various different levels that might be interested in this information? Could you meet with them privately? Could you share it in other ways? Industry leaders, are there other folks across higher ed that the people that you are trying to engage, the leadership of your institution, might care about that you could share this information with, and that would be problematic for them. Students and parents is potentially a little bit more traditional thing that we think about, and here I'd really think about how you could share that and which groups of students and parents that folks might care about. I wanted to pause here and see if folks have other ideas. If you want to place them in the chat, that would be great. I see we're also having conversation about questions. Any other thoughts about audiences we might be able to share this type of information with? Key donors, yeah. So I talked earlier about Arizona State and the information that we found. So after we did have a press conference where we shared that information and a lot of other details that I had collected as part of the research that I was doing. And as I said, it was covered by a bunch of different media. But then, and other folks are putting taxpayers, particularly for public universities, but also private, right? They're still nonprofits and alumni. So over a period of about 6 months after that press conference, we continued to share the information we had collected with a lot of these different audiences. And I put together a spreadsheet of key donors to the university. And instead of sending out the information to everyone all at once, every couple of weeks I would send a letter, and we had a full report of all the different things that I found to a couple of donors. So it lasted a long time, right? Took it to the academic senate. We went to several different events that the president was speaking at across the country and also in other countries, and found some allies to be able to share that information. We also shared it with alumni as well, and with folks down at the state legislature. But it wasn't all at once, right? Really thinking to the last point here about timing, right? When and to who is critical, and being able to think about the sequence of when things will impact and which audiences are the most important, and maybe saving some of those audiences for later so that you can continue to have some impact as you're engaging folks over time. Because if you just do it all at once, it oftentimes will dissipate, and you don't necessarily build up the same sort of power to be able to engage with the folks that you're trying to get their attention as you would otherwise. Any other thoughts on audiences before we jump into the legal approaches? Cool. So we've got some conversation and questions going on in the chat box, and folks should continue to engage with that, but we will definitely talk about it collectively after we finish up here. I'll pass it over to Lisa.
Hi, yeah. So there's a couple different things if you feel like there may be actual potential violations of law, and that can be at a civil level, and it can also be at a criminal level. So at a civil level, which is probably where most of this is going to sort of fit in with any of your incorporated schools, most of it, the time it's not going to be criminal. Anyone can bring a civil case, an entity, an individual, the government, and so it can be brought at both the state and the federal level. So you have to sort of figure out where your violations lie, whether it's, for example, corporate California law, in which case you go to the California Attorney General. If it's at a federal court, it might there might be a civil statute associated with the IRS. There's all sorts of, but you have to make sure you identify which it is. And in general, most of what you're dealing with is going to be a civil violation. So that's basically, and it's whenever someone basically doesn't follow through on a legal contract, right? So it could be a person or an entity. They have an agreement and they don't follow through. In our case, it was a trustee or a board member who doesn't follow through with their fiduciary responsibilities under a corporate law. And then there's another sort of example in the criminal case. If we could get the next. Criminal cases are different than civil in that the government has to bring the charge on behalf of the people of the United States, or on behalf of the people of the state of California, or in other words, an individual can't bring that, or a corporation can't bring that. It has to be brought by the government. It can be at a very lower level, a misdemeanor for sort of crimes of information, or it can be an indictment at a felony or a serious crime level. But again, it can be brought at the state, just like the civil, or the federal level. If it's at the state level, it's going to be actually the U.S. Attorney General. And if it's at the state level, it's going to be your district attorney. So if it occurred in the city of San Francisco, it's going to be the San Francisco district attorney. And then, of course, there's times when criminal activity also is civil in nature in terms of violations. So you can have murder, for example, but also you can be sued for wrongful death on a civil level. So, they can kind of cross each other as well. But like I said, most of the time, where you might get criminal cases is in IRS violations. So that is going to be possible criminal federal level activity. So again, though, you can't get the locals involved in that because obviously the IRS is federal law. So you're going to have to escalate to a higher court. But in general, if you're going to get a criminal act, it's going to be most likely an IRS violation. So those are just kind of a very, very, very upper level discussion of criminal versus civil cases. If you want to move on to a legal action, go ahead, next slide. So we can have others jump in, Corey or Sarah on this too, but in general, this is just, I know we've had a lot of people sort of asking questions about this seems overwhelming, it's a lot of information. Remember that if your focus is on financial transactions in this case, which is what this training is about, you might want to start with a financial institution and looking at the relationships there. Who's on the board of the financial institution? Who are the trustees? Who's on the board of directors? And then trying to link those people, if possible, to your trustees or your board. You should also keep in mind that there's another level of law that we didn't even go into here, which is probate law, which is if you're directly a trustee of a trust or a fund. Probate law is even stricter than corporate law. So fiduciary duties are far more elevated. They're stricter. Even the appearance of a conflict, the appearance of self-dealing is a major problem for a trustee. I'll tell you right now that our board of the school that we investigated made themselves directors just for that reason. They made sure to not qualify themselves as trustees to keep themselves exempt from probate law. So in other words, it is complicated where to start, where to look. You could do a very brief look at your board and look for people who deal with Wall Street, people who are that have private equity companies, people like that. Those are going to be the kinds of people that you want to sort of start with, that have more of a financial acumen, that would be more likely to be involved in real estate transactions with banks or anything like that. So again, you have to do the research, you have to put in the time, but you want to do it strategically. You just don't want to start you probably shouldn't just start by looking at every single board member. There's definitely ways to be more strategic about this. And, again, we're going to be trying to do a white paper on this in the future. And so anybody who wants to jump in and do some of this research and get the basics to us would be more likely to be involved in the white paper. And if there is some there, and you would have a whole team of researchers basically working for you to, all of us on the call and all the people that are associated with with Sarah's organization would have, you'd have access to those resources, and we could help you in whatever campaign you're working on. If there's something to, something to it in terms of financial, missteps or bad actors. So this is sort of where we go with the next steps, but anybody, Sarah or Corey, if you want to add in, please do.
Yeah, I'll just say you want to remember the needs of your campaign and what your escalation plan is. This can be very time consuming research. So you want to figure out, what is the status of your campaign? Are the board members being hostile towards you? Is it worth spending your time doing this research? But if you have the capacity and the resources at your local or personally, it's worth honing your research skills to plan for future campaigns. But some people are split on whether it's even worthwhile to do this research. I think it's valuable in terms of finding out where the power at your organization lies and where it's connected to. But again, it has to work with your campaign and what your escalation plan is.
Yeah, and for most folks, hopefully you saw it, and we'll share afterwards, we have a higher education finance research primer, so to speak. And the first questions we have on there before you start any research at all are, what are your goals? Why are you doing this research? What are you trying to accomplish? And you really, as a strategic researcher who's been doing this for almost 15 years for various different unions and community organizations, you have to remember and know that from the beginning, and then stay focused on what you're trying to research. Otherwise, you're going to go down a lot of rabbit holes and end up spending more time and energy than you should, right? And so we're trying to give you a lot of tools and an overview here and potential areas that you might want to look into. And then you're going to need to come up with a plan depending on your amount of time. Corey, is there a way you can go back to the slide we're seeing your say our names piece, right?
Yeah, 1 second.
No problem. So this slide is really trying to go through and help you think about how to approach doing this particular set of work, but could also be similar principles otherwise, right? And thinking about, what are your resources? Is it just you? Are there multiple other folks that you're working with? We already talked about thinking about your goals. And then what timeline do you have in terms of the overall campaign that you're trying to run, right? And thinking through what does that mean for what I'll be able to do, and prioritizing the types of information that you want to look into, prioritizing the people that you want to look into based on where you think you'll actually find more information. Because when we start this, a lot of times we have instincts already of where things might be problematic. Trust those instincts, right? And focus your time in there. And then bring your leaders together. If you're in a union or community-based organization that has leaders, really, it takes some time on the front end to train people and to involve folks, but it's worth it long term in terms of building capacity to get folks trained up to be able to do this kind of thing. And it really is an internal organizing opportunity. And then come back together frequently and reassess, right? Like, you may be finding stuff that you didn't think you'd find, go in a different direction, need to look into something else more deeply. But you need, if multiple folks are doing this research, and or you're working with organizers that are also collecting information from workers or community, you need to share that information with each other. If you're doing this in isolation, it's not going to work, right? You need to share with your team and think through things together. That's the best way to approach this. So I'll stop there and see if Corey or Lisa have anything to add to that.
Yeah, just there was one question about sort of delays on public records requests, and it's going to depend on what state you're in. But in the state of California, the only way to hold groups accountable on public records requests is to, literally write to them every time they miss a deadline, document what they're doing. If they're a responsible organization, they will respond, and they will take it seriously if they violated a deadline. The problem is, if they don't care, they can just basically blow you off, and there aren't a lot of repercussions. And then in the end, they can always say things like, it's not in the public interest to disclose this, or they can call it proprietary, or internal deliberations. There's all sorts of exceptions, but really it's just to stay on top of it. Always record your deadlines, always build a case. If you don't build a case in writing, you can never sue them, ever, if you don't build a case in writing. So you can't say, well, they missed this deadline. Well, you have to document that they missed it. You have to document that they responded, that they didn't respond, that they stalled, all that. It all has to be in writing, and it all has to be documented. So if you really are serious about it, in the end, I've been with organizations where we eventually just had to sue for documents. And that was the only way we got them. But again, most organizations, if they're even mildly conscientious, do take violations of especially if you're in bargaining and it's a violation of sort of what they need to provide you for bargaining. They take it seriously because you can file an unfair labor practice, and that has teeth as well. So again, it's just really important to document it, but you just have to stay on it, and you have to be very diligent, and you have to keep pushing for rolling productions. And if they don't have the whole production, you have to be very flexible and always make yourself available. And also one thing you can do is that they have at least under California law, they have an obligation, if the material is difficult to define or difficult to, they're having trouble understanding what you want, they have a responsibility under the law to make it easier for you to find the information and produce the information. They actually have to provide that service to you. And so that's something you should check with under your own statutes in your state.
Yeah, so, and we'd also encourage public records requests shouldn't be your first, second, even probably your fifth thing that you go to in terms of trying to get the information, because it does take a long time. It's almost an art in terms of writing it, and making sure that you're clear about what exactly you're looking for. And you're going to signal to people that you're looking for that information. Public records requests are shared across the institution usually when they happen. So just be aware of all of that, and don't expect to get the information immediately that way, right? Oftentimes I would recommend, going in person and requesting things from folks that are doing administrative work and really trying to cultivate that relationship, and work with students or other folks, particularly if you're looking in higher education, that could request that information. And don't need to be super specific about why they want it, because technically speaking, they shouldn't need to know why you want it, but they will ask. So, keep all of those things in mind.
And let me just dovetail that by saying, you will be surprised at how much you can find by using the Google site search. There's a lot out there on the internet. Sometimes it's meant to be on a public page, sometimes it's not, but you can find out quite a little bit about the institutions you're working at and the people who control those institutions, but just by using Google.
So we had a couple of other questions in the chat. We talked about the public records requests. We also talked a little bit about keeping track of things via screenshots and other things like that. I think that conversation hopefully answered that question. We had a question about what leverage can be gained from knowing that a university has registered as a redevelopment corporation. And I saw Jameson, you and Corey were exchanging, but if you guys want to talk a little bit more about that, want to jump in there?
Sure. That could be something as simple as the university wanting to undertake large projects and not have the institution's assets be shield the university from some liability. But because there's a separate corporate entity, you can do the same kind of research that you would do into the university, its board members, or their corporations. You can conduct the same research into that corporate entity. So it's not necessarily foul play. It could just be a corporate legal maneuver so that the university is safe if the project fails, for example.
Jameson, feel free to jump in if you want to follow up at all. All right, hearing nothing. You can also follow up with Corey, myself, or Lisa, or let us know. We can share with the group too. I think it was Valerie asking, are you seeing any reductions in availability of data on government websites given the Trump administration's aversion to transparency and accountability? Corey or Lisa, you want to jump in, or I can?
I wrote no, that I haven't seen that. Now, granted, we're not writing to federal agencies in general, right? So most of what we're doing now, if I had been writing to the SEC or a federal agency, then that might be different. I don't have any personal experience with asking for documents at this point for that, or having the disappearance of certain documents on web pages. I haven't personally experienced that at this point.
Yeah, I definitely know folks that have seen on federal websites for various different things, stuff disappearing and less transparency. But I think folks, one thing that I would say is there's a wide variety around transparency, and it's not along partisan lines or party lines at all, whether or not people will share information. So definitely trying to get that information from government entities locally in different ways is worth trying. And there are different agencies and institutions and others that have this information. So really thinking about where you might be able to get that is important. Corey, anything else you would add?
No.
There was just a question about, are there particulars that arise from a current economic context? I don't know I'm not sure exactly what you mean, Aaron, but we certainly have had universities and schools claiming financial hardship because of COVID that have nothing to do with COVID. They have to do with financial transactions they did 5 years ago that started tanking the school. They then claimed it was issues with COVID that brought the school to a halt. So it's, we have also, just in our own union, municipalities that are claiming that like crazy, and they have reserves galore, and they're still going to use it as an excuse to do layoffs. I don't know if that's, I don't know about lobbying, requesting for stimulus funds. Certainly we've had schools that have received some of those funds through the, CARES Act, but could you clarify your question a little bit more?
Sure. I was partially just curious, but also, yeah, at Rutgers, they are claiming fiscal emergency somewhat similarly with like millions and millions of dollars of reserves and not including stimulus funds on their budget documents that they're giving us. So I guess I was just curious how things that we should be more aware of, or research tools that are specific to address what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Corey.
That's exactly how these two trainings we put on got started. Like, we had a school saying they have a financial crisis brought about from COVID. We saw they had debt from many years ago that was overtaking the university's finances. And then we started to sort of put the pieces together about who brought in the bank to the university and what corporate ties do the board members have. So all of these tools that we've gone over in these last two trainings are you can use them to kind of hold the university accountable to what it's saying to the public if they're claiming that they are in a financial crisis. Well, why are they in a financial crisis, and how deep does it go?
Yeah, and also, Aaron, you'd be amazed what you can find in board notes if you can get them, right? Because if they're going to claim, like if you're in bargaining and they claim financial hardship, as you know, you can then ask for all financial documents. You can ask for almost all documents if they're claiming hardship. And in general, they say things in board meetings they don't think they're going to be made public. They basically say things about who they brought in or who they're, I mean, like we had somebody admit that they brought the financial institution in that they had $100 million of business with. You wouldn't think they would admit something like that in a meeting in public, you know. In addition, we had members, you know, we've had people admit, again, just in general, I don't know if you can ask for emails, certainly for public universities. If they're public, you can. And I've again, that's a public records request, but you might even be able to get emails if you had, for example, board members who are like adjunct professors who might have emails that they could, again, that's something you have to do very discreetly, but catching people in what they say in what they think is a private transaction or communication is always a useful tool if you can get it.
All right. So another question we had was, what is a good example of a good rollout of the information from a recent campaign? Corey or Lisa want to jump in on an example?
Well, I don't personally work. I mean, I can tell you that in my own research, whether it's with municipalities or with higher ed, you know, you never want to go to the press first. In my opinion, you always want to go and exhaust your back channels, whether it's because if you burn bridges through the press first, you can't then do your back channels. So you might have members of the board that you can talk to that are friendly to you. You can have donors, you can have alumni, you can have all those sorts of backdoor meetings that you would first want to sort of exhaust, see what pressure can be exerted from internal relationships. It's always, in my opinion, best to exert or use those ties, use those relationships, community groups that have a lot of power over the school, that donate a lot. Then once you've exhausted all those sort of back channels and aren't getting any traction, you know, then going more public, whether that's community action first even, and then at the same time press articles, but very sort of, you know, sort of spread out, not sort of shooting all your, you know, delivering all your eggs in one basket, basically drawing those out over a long term. As Sarah mentioned with the Arizona campaign, they got multiple hits from the same information in different sources and different papers and different sort of venues. So for me, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question, except to say that I never recommend going to the press right away, because again, you burn relationships that way, and then they can claim they haven't had a chance to address it. If you'd only come to them privately first, they could have addressed it, and so you kind of burn that opening. Corey, I don't know if you've had more.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful with how you use the information publicly. That's why I said before, like, you have to consider what role this research has in an escalating campaign. For some of you, this research may only serve the purpose of helping you make very targeted RFI requests to the university. So if you make a broad RFI and they say, no, that's not relevant to bargaining, but then you've found information through this kind of research that shows you that there is something related to bargaining, you can make a more targeted RFI and sort of put management's counsel on the defensive in terms of what they will or will not provide to you. So I don't necessarily think taking things public is always the option. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. I would say bring it to the membership, bring it to your allies, and figure out ways to organize around it before bringing it to the public.
We had a question about credit ratings and reserves. You know, that's the typical battle cry of every municipality and every school, is that if they use the reserves, then, you know, their credit rating is going to be harmed. Well, you know, they live in fear of credit rating agencies in general. If their reserves are to the standard that in general that the Government Accountability Office, I mean the GFOA approves, for the most part, they're not going to have their rating affected. It's a great excuse for them to assume that that's going to happen, and that's how they leverage getting sort of not using the emergency reserves. But you can also point to the fact that if the school starts sort of falling apart and not being able to pay operating costs, that's going to affect their credit rating as well. Right? If they start laying off faculty and losing students, that's going to affect their credit rating as well. If their reputation goes down as a school that can't pay its bills and trustees that can't manage their money, that's going to affect their credit rating as well. So you can use all those excuses to basically say your credit rating is going to be affected by all these other issues that go into account by not using your emergency reserves. It also depends on how much they're going to use them, right? If their standard is 20%, but the GFOA says 16, then they're above what the GFOA says. And it's unlikely that a credit rating agency is going to downgrade them. But, you know, just know that those are often hollow, empty threats that the credit rating agencies might even make. And again, you know, there are consequences when you lay off faculty. There are consequences when your school doesn't use, you know, the resources if it can't run itself. So again, you could always point out that there's other factors that are going to affect. And you would even be able to look at how I would use evidence, for example, when schools have been downgraded for not paying their bills, or when schools have been downgraded for reduced enrollment, or whatever it is, right? Not fundraising properly. So all sorts of other issues where credit ratings might be affected. And reserves do these points about reserves apply to endowments? Yeah, certainly. You mean drops in endowment? Yeah, the more they have to use their endowment, if it's restricted endowment, if they keep asking for money out of their endowment, that will cause problems. But again, the question is, why are they asking for money through endowments? So yes, it could affect your. I don't know if you're talking about separate category, Jim. I'm not sure exactly what your question is, but. Oh, would it lower the credit rating? It certainly possibly could lower the credit rating if their endowment is shrinking. But again, I would make them focus more on why their endowment is shrinking. Have their fundraising efforts gone down? Are they not making an effort to fundraise? We feel that our school that we're working with actually made a collective effort not to fundraise. So they could tank the school and make it look as if the school was going under. We even found somebody said that someone suggested in a board meeting not to fundraise, actively not to fundraise. And so this is something that's going on a lot. I'm just gonna go on mute.
Yeah, I mean, I think with endowments, the first question, a lot of things you need to look at, and one is how much percentage are they taking out on a regular basis? How much have they been raising? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? As Lisa is talking about, what is the return that they're getting? So there's the percent return, but there's a separate, what's the percentage that they are typically taking out every year already, right? So there's some key factors in looking at endowments and understanding and it's also over time, right? Not just this last year, but what are the patterns looking like? And then looking at other similar sized institutions and what they're doing as well before you just kind of like accept whatever is being said, to really understand what's happening, I would say. Those are good things to take a look at just in your initial.
Yeah, and Jim, yeah, it's not a separate conversation. I think like Sarah mentioned, it depends on how much the endowment is, what percentage it is of your operating costs. You know, all of that is going to, like, it's all going to matter. It's all going to be relative to the university or the school. If their endowment is shrinking overall, that's an issue. But yeah, it depends on what conditions we need. Yeah, so it's going to be specific. But I don't know if I'd go to an endowment to save. Again, it depends on how the condition the endowment's in, right? But really, if the school's in that bad a shape that they're going to their endowment, I wouldn't be worried too much about the credit rating. So what is a credit rating for anyway? It's for issuing debt. A credit rating is unless there's some kind of accreditation that goes along with their debt. It's about issuing future debt. Their credit rating is only going to affect their future debt, unless it affects their accreditation, which is another issue. But which I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. If a credit rating affects your accreditation through the education channels, I don't know the answer to that. But I wouldn't worry so much if the school's having to go to its endowment. It's not going to be eligible for a loan anyway, probably. Whether its credit rating goes up or down, you're having trouble if you're relying on your endowment to save the school.
All right. Any other questions folks have? I see Jamie piggybacking on Stephanie's question. Our college also used GASB 73 or some other number about having to accrue future retirement liability to attack our retiree medical benefits plan. So is there a question related to that, Jamie, at all?
No, I guess I'm sorry, let me look at Stephanie's questions again. Well, it just had to do with credit rating too, I guess was what put it on my mind, because they used it as, part of it was simply, hey, we've got to get our balance sheet straight so that we can borrow money for debt or capital projects and things. I can't remember if it's, it was the government accounting standard. I don't remember if it's 73 or what it is. And so since they have to accrue for our future liability, they kind of use that against us to hack away at our retiree medical benefits. So I guess I was trying to think, like, what is the research or the counter argument to it? Like, I couldn't think of something research wise that necessarily helped. So yeah, that was.
Well, what would help is if there are other areas that they're spending. In other words, like, it's always about pension. It's always about retiree medical benefits. It's always about that in every jurisdiction, right? We're going bankrupt because of our pension liability. You have to look at what else they're spending their money on. And that's the only other argument you can use. So the analogy would be like in a municipality where, 45% of the budget goes to the police or 50% of the budget goes to the police. Like, so you have to think about, is it really their pension liability? They've been budgeting for their future liability forever. So it would only be if there's sort of changes in sort of the return that's required, or right. So that actually changes depending on CalPERS, CalSTRS, depends on. So if the return amount gets dropped or reduced, then that can change the retirement liability that they wouldn't have budgeted for. But if they've been budgeting for it, it's not a surprise. So it shouldn't be something like over that's drastically affecting them in one year. In other words, they've known for a long time what that liability would be, right? So my guess is they're using that as an excuse, and there's probably some other transaction that's in the budget that you need to find that's tanking the school. And that's the only argument I can really give you. If every institution makes this claim. I've never known one that doesn't.
That's helpful. Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, sure.
And Aaron is asking any particular sources or tips regarding researching finances of athletics.
I've never investigated athletics, so I don't know what the reporting. I would first look to find out what the reporting requirements are. So I would look in the school's chapter or like ordinances or bylaws and find out what their reporting standards are in terms of, I don't know if, mean just the whole department, or whether there's athletes that are getting certain amounts of money. and where that money has to be reported. I would look at the reporting requirements and then go to those, like find out what they are. I think it would depend on the program, what level the program is, what division they're in, and whether they have, what kind of payments they allow to athletes, how the athletes get their scholarships, all those things. Those are going to be sources that you're going to have to find out what the reporting requirements are, and then follow up with those agencies to know if there are reporting requirements. Otherwise, if there aren't reporting requirements, it might have to be a public records request. But I'm not that familiar with that. All I know is when I don't know something about an individual area, I go to what the reporting requirements are in the statutes of the school. And then I use those databases to find out what's been reported and what hasn't.
I would say it depends what you're trying to find.
Yeah. And Mary Jo is highlighting that Howard, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Bunis, I think, investigated athletics budgets for a bunch of universities. And he actually also did, and I will share following this, an analysis with the University of Michigan of their finances, including endowments and reserves. And I just want to highlight the University of Michigan, that their president just voted down at least pieces of their Board of Regents pieces of the budget, including the tuition increase and other stuff. So I will share out those resources in terms of the broader budget analysis that we're now starting to talk about, which is certainly related to the debt pieces that we covered in the first training, and now the board pieces that we're talking about in this training. But I want to plug, and I was hoping it would happen sooner, but it looks like beginning of August, the team at ASME 3299 will be leading a training that talks about countering the austerity frame and how to think that through, and buckets of where you can look for money and all of that that we'll be doing. And again, that's at the beginning of August, since we're getting close to wrapping up here, and we'll be sure to share that as soon as we have a date and a time with all of you. And for all of our trainings, we've developed sort of worksheets to go through the work that we talked about in the PowerPoint and verbally. And we had one for this as well that we sent out. If you registered at the last minute, you didn't get it, but I will send it out as a follow-up along with the recording and the PowerPoint. And we really encourage you to use those. And we have one that we're developing for that training. And I'm going to try to send it out ahead of time, even if we don't have the austerity frame counter full training until August. So we'll have that out there. I want to highlight that myself, Corey, and Lisa are really, really interested in working with folks that are looking at debt at their schools. And if you're having trouble, if you've tried and we're not able to find the documents or get into the weeds, please reach out to us, and we'll try to help you be able to locate them. Or if you have the documents and are having some difficulty analyzing them, we'd love to work with you. As Lisa indicated earlier, we're looking at putting together what we sometimes call a white paper or report about debt in higher ed institutions across the country, and how all the terrible stories and what's happening that could be a tool for all of our campaigns.
Yes, someone did ask a question earlier about not being able to find data, I believe in Massachusetts. So reach out to one of us. I'm going out of town for the next 4 days, but in general, there's lots of places you should be able to find that. If it's a bond, you're going to be able to find it, because it has to go through Emma, and there's official channels, there's publications. It has to be published if it's a bond, because only government entities can issue bonds. So just reach out to one of us, and we can try to help you walk through how to find that data.
All right. Well, we'll put our emails in the chat box one more time. So it's best to reach out to all three of us, and then we can see who has time, and or if there are other folks we can pull in to help address and support you with your questions or work that you're doing across the country. We really appreciate everyone's time and for jumping on this training. Hope that was super helpful. And please, reach out, keep engaging. We'll be in touch about the next training as well. And have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all.